well, the Greens this morning are being accused of setting back climate policy another decade. It is refusing to lend its support in the Senate to pass the safeguards mechanism. If it is going to lend its support, it wants Labor to stop any new coal and gas projects. Joining me live now is the independent MP Kylea Tink. Kylea, thanks so much for your time. What side of the argument do you fall on here? Is that a reasonable request from the Greens?
Look, I think the bottom line is we have about 215 emitters in this country that are producing the vast majority of carbon emissions. We need to embrace a system that enables us to work with those emitters to drop those emissions. Is the legislation that the government's currently putting forward perfect? Absolutely not. But if we don't start, we end up going nowhere. So I think fundamental to understanding where we're going is this is a process of transition. It needs to be a planned transition. I don't support new coal and gas projects. I don't believe we need any more gas in this country, but I would hate to see this legislation fall over simply because of that wall at the moment.
So it's not a red line for you, and nor should it be for the Greens?
For me, I think what we need to be focusing on, and indeed it's what I'm already doing, is working with the government to make this legislation as strong as it possibly can be. The whole point of the safeguard mechanism, Laura, is that we capture these companies within an ecosystem where they can work to reduce their gross emissions. Now, if they do better than that in any given year, they're given a credit. That credit they can then sell to somebody else within the system. Where it starts to fall apart is when they can actually be accessing credits outside that system. And you end up basically with polluters who are able to pay to continue to pollute. So no, for me, it's not a red line. I want to be really clear on that. It's not a red line. But I think what it does is provides a really important focal point for us as a parliament to recognise the complexities around that and to move this forward.
Sure, you just said you believe there's enough coal and gas projects, and I think you emphasised gas more, but I want to look at the current energy crisis we've got at the moment. Isn't this the whole problem, that we don't have enough gas in the system? And that is, really a price setter when it comes to electricity.
Look, I think that's what the people who play in this system would like us to believe, but it's simply not true. 7% of the gas that's taken out of the ground here in Australia is used domestically. So when we hear arguments about people wanting to have greater access to coal and gas, what they're actually arguing is they want to be able to extract resources so they can sell them overseas at what are currently record prices. So that is the truth of it, and I think it's really important. For us here in Australia, the biggest opportunity we have to address our energy crisis is to electrify everything. There's modelling done which shows if the federal government invested just $12 billion over the next 8 years in supporting households to be able to transition to solar panels on their roofs, electric stove tops, hot water heat pumps, we'd be getting there. We'd be moving much faster, and households would be saving $3,000 to $5,000 a year. Out of interest, Laura, last year the Australian government spent $12 billion on fossil fuel subsidies. So this is money that's in the system. We just need to choose to actively redirect it.
Oh, okay, but when it comes to gas, you say only about 7% is being used domestically on the East Coast, I should say. The WA has its own gas reservation policy. It's different.
Yes.
So are you using your power at the moment to have a reservation policy on the East Coast, acknowledging that, we still need gas for the transition to renewables?
Look, we do need a certain level of gas to enable us to transition, and I think the key word you just used then is transition. It needs to be a planned transition. I think the price caps that were brought in last year were an appropriate mechanism to enable us to prioritise that transition in the next 12 months. My understanding is that a domestic reserve policy on the East Coast is not something that is actually worth our time considering or fighting for, given that it is much simpler. Well, it's much simpler and easier for us to expedite the move for houses off gas and get them towards electrification. Let's be really clear here. A home that has solar panels on its roof and is able to power its own energy needs gets off this reliance on fossil fuels. So the only people who win by continuing to embed fossil fuels into our housing sector are the fossil fuel companies.
But isn't it the case though, Kylea, that in this transition phase, okay, if you're advocating for people to get more solar panels on their roofs, get more wind power, the more people that are out of the grid, and that can afford to do that are those that are perhaps more wealthier, and then those people still on the grid pay more.
Yeah, but this is where I think it's a really important discussion to be had, and that is how do we ensure that the most vulnerable and those that most need the support are the ones that are being given it by the federal government and state governments. Don't get me wrong, I'm a massive advocate for continuing subsidies to help households get to electrify. I'm a massive advocate for expanding that subsidy regime so that household batteries can be brought into it. And I'm also a massive advocate for ensuring that landlords are incentivised to make sure that rental properties are absolutely as efficient as they can possibly be. So these are levers we can pull as a federal government. And for as long as we stay stuck in this environment where we're arguing about gas and coal, we're not actually taking the forward momentum and going, right, what do we need to do in the next 5 years, 10 years, so that in 10 years' time, my kids aren't having to worry about the price of gas coming into their houses.